Queen Elizabeth has died at the age of 96, and I, for one, am horrified by how many people seemed to have no problem at all making this into a political event. Like, on what planet is the death of a monarch who is handpicked by God herself to be the political head of the United Kingdom and 14 other sovereign states such as Canada, whose constitution enshrines that monarch as the leader of the country, such that it is nearly impossible for Canada to ever not be a monarchy? On what planet is the death of that person political? Oh, hold on. This planet, it's Earth. It's political here on Earth. It's really quite obviously political. There are certainly good arguments for and against a country being ruled by a monarch in the year of our Lord 2022. On the pro side, I've heard Brits argue that the royal family are good for tourism and the very important commemorative plate market. On the con side, I've heard marginalized people in countries that have been devastated by the British monarchy's history of colonialism, where they raped and murdered, pillaged and enslaved millions of people in countries like Barbados, Jamaica, India, Ireland, Kenya. I've heard those people say, fuck the commemorative plate market. And, both of these, I think, are valid arguments. Let's just pick one of those countries I listed to talk a little bit more about it. Kenya. Since as far back as the late 19th century or so, the British monarchy used British armed forces to occupy Kenya, declaring it a colony in 1920, despite the protests of the people who actually lived there. Within months of Queen Elizabeth II, the one who just died, ascending the throne in 1952, British forces put down a big Kenyan rebellion by using castration, systematic beatings, rape, sexual assault with bottles, all of which was apparently sanctioned at the top levels of the British government. They put thousands of civilians in internment camps where dozens of them were massacred. And all of this was revealed by the colonialists' own records, which forced the British government to pay out nearly £20 million to 5,000 survivors in 2012. So yeah, when people talk about the history of colonialism that Elizabeth and her family engaged in, they're not just talking about ancient history, like when Elizabeth I funded the earliest slave traders around 1600, or when Charles II established the Royal African Company in 1660 to begin capturing Africans, branding them, and transporting them to Barbados to be sold as slaves. They're also talking about recent history, atrocities that happened within the memory of living people, massacres that occurred while Elizabeth II was head of state and de facto leader of the forces who were hammering innocent people to death. So, yeah. Now, you might think that the Queen was always just a symbol, at least Queen Elizabeth II, a symbol of a powerful monarch, a symbol of vast wealth, a symbol of horrific colonialism. She could only remain queen provided that she stay politically neutral, right? Yes, she reserved the right to review and give her consent to bills passed in Parliament, but that was just a formality, right? She would never reject a bill. She would always consent because to do otherwise would upset the delicate balance that allows England to remain functionally democratic while still allowing her to be queen and for her family to collect millions of pounds from taxpayers each year, which they don't necessarily pay taxes on. This is the argument that actually inspired me to make this video, because following her death, my first thought was, oh God, now we get King Charles III. Fuck. Because the former Prince Charles is an enormous clown. So, many old school skeptics like myself know this. He's made no secret of his love of pseudoscientific bunk like homeopathy. Homeopathy, of course, is the stupidest of all snake oils. It's the idea that water remembers something that you put in it, which is no longer there. And also that you can cure pretty much any ailment by putting in and then removing things from water that cause the disease you're suffering from. So, for instance, if you have itchy skin, maybe you can cure it by dunking a leaf of poison ivy in a glass of water, and then throwing that glass of water into a swimming pool, and then taking another glass of that out and then throwing that into the Pacific Ocean, and then taking a glass of the Pacific Ocean and drinking it. I'm not making this up. That's literally what homeopathy is. Charles was so enamored with homeopathy that in 2019, he actually became the official patron of the Faculty of Homeopathy, a British group that promotes the snake oil in question. He also has publicly expressed fears about nanotechnology, asking the Royal Society to investigate the risk of tiny machines reproducing to infinity and swallowing the universe. It's a nightmare situation for Prince Charles. And, obviously he also thinks genetically modified crops are an environmental disaster. Note that in that case, in this article, he also says some things that I think are correct. Things like what we should be talking about is food security, not food production. It's true that for the most part, the world makes enough food for everyone, but for some reason, not everyone gets food. I wonder what that reason could be. We'll just have to trust Charles that he's correct when he says that India's Punjab, which fell under British rule after the Sikh Empire was violently defeated by the East India Company in the Battle of Gujarat, was horrifically damaged by, excessive approaches to modern forms of agriculture. But I digress. I and many other critics of the former prince's loony beliefs am worried that now as king, he has an even greater platform from which to institute those beliefs, which is why I've heard so much in recent days about the purely symbolic, apolitical formality in which the monarchy simply stands aside and allows democracy to progress as it will. And honestly, I'm a little surprised to hear those arguments from people who live in England itself, because it makes me wonder if they read their nation's newspapers. Because, first of all, the former Prince Charles has a long history of attempting to use his position as the son of someone to influence society to his whims. Pestering the Royal Academy about nanobots is one thing, but there's also the fact that in 2005, he commissioned a report that called for the National Health Services to offer coverage for osteopathy, chiropractic, acupuncture, homeopathy, and herbal medicine. The report was not written by a doctor, but by an economist named Christopher Smallwood, and the editor of the Lancet Journal called it dangerous nonsense. Edzard Ernst, who at the time was the director of complementary medicine at the University of Exeter's Peninsula Medical School, was critical of the report as well and said its conclusions were written before the authors had searched for evidence that might match them. This led Prince Charles' secretary to file a complaint against Ernst with the university, and then, according to Reuters, Ernst's complementary medicine research unit at Exeter's Peninsula School of Medicine had been threatened with outright closure, but the university has now offered it a reprieve and says it is seeking a successor to Ernst to lead it. It looked as though I had to go, and that was the price for the unit to continue, Ernst said. I pay the price gladly, as it is a small price to pay for the unit to continue. The prince claimed to Reuters that he had nothing to do with pressuring Ernst to step down. In 2014, the BBC revealed that Charles had been outright lobbying the Welsh government to add alternative medicine pseudoscience to their health services. Peter Hain, a former cabinet minister, told the BBC, "When I was Secretary of State for Northern Ireland in 2005 to 2007, he was delighted when I told him that since I was running the place, I could more or less do what I wanted to do. I was able to introduce a trial for complementary medicine on the NHS, and it had spectacularly good results. that people's well-being and health was vastly improved. And when he learned about this, he was really enthusiastic and tried to persuade the Welsh government to do the same thing, and the government in Whitehall to do the same thing for England, but not successfully, added Mr. Hayne. Other politicians have said the same about his lobbying efforts. According to the Daily Fail, former Environment Minister Michael Meacher said he and the Prince would consort together quietly to affect policy on climate change and genetically modified crops. I knew that he largely agreed with me, and he knew that I largely agreed with him, said Mr. Meacher. We were together in trying to persuade Tony Blair to change course. Labour MP David Blunkett said Charles tried to convince him to open more grammar schools, and even though that wasn't to be, Blunkett said he didn't really mind the lobbying because, and I quote, "If you're waiting to be the king of the United Kingdom and you've waited a very long time, you genuinely have to engage with something or you'd go spare." That really rings true with me because, I got bored the other day and I was considering a replay of Skyrim or maybe knitting something, but instead I got on the phone and tried to influence important policy decisions that would affect millions of lives. Despite this, many people remain convinced that now that Prince Charles is King Charles III, and presumably no longer at risk of going spare, he will keep his trap shut and remain apolitical, just like his beloved, dearly departed mother. Except she didn't do that. Last year, The Guardian revealed that they had evidence showing that Queen Elizabeth II lobbied the government to change at least 4 laws over the past several decades. First, they found that the Queen used a formality known as the Queen's consent to hide her own wealth. By British law, Parliament must inform the monarch of any legislation that might affect the monarch before it passes. In November of 1973, the Queen was informed that a new potential law would reveal how much money she has. And so she sent her private lawyer to inform MPs that this would be embarrassing for the royal family. And it would be equally embarrassing if the bill included a specific carve-out for the royal family, because then people would know that they were trying to hide something embarrassing. And so the Queen's lawyer got together with the MPs and figured out a way to fix this. They made it so that the government could exempt certain companies from disclosing their finances. And then the government created a shell corporation to hold the Queen's wealth, and then they exempted that company from having to disclose their financials. And that is why all of the articles you see about how much money Charles is inheriting are only guessing at the exact number. Soon after publishing these findings, The Guardian tossed out a few more examples they found of the Queen being very political indeed. In 1982, she withheld her consent for a bill that would protect national monuments because that would take over monuments that were currently under another royal commission, meaning that Parliament couldn't even debate the bill because they didn't have her consent. In 1968, she withheld consent for a new traffic safety bill until it was amended so that a key clause didn't apply to her own estates, which otherwise would have been included. In fact, that was the entire point of that bill, because the public had access to drive on some of those roads. And in 1975, the Queen's private lawyers cornered civil servants and warned them that if they didn't make changes to a new land leasing bill, they would escalate their complaints to a senior minister. That's right. It was a real Queen Karen moment. Oh, you want to restrict our ability to lease land for development? I'm going to need to speak to your managers. Now, these are just a handful of incidents which a major newspaper found evidence of the Queen's meddling in politics and had the ability to publish them. What has she done other than that that's still tucked away in the shadows of history? And what might King Charles III do now that he has the same ability? Look, I'm not suggesting that Brits start investing in guillotines this fall, but I am going to point out that just last year, Barbados removed Queen Elizabeth II as their head of state and installed Rihanna in her place. Well, I mean, technically, they made their governor general a prime minister, and then in the same ceremony declared Rihanna a national hero. But Basically, that's what happened. So here's hoping that more former colonies like Jamaica follow their lead now that a somewhat likable but still extremely problematic monarch has been replaced with, well, a guy who was recorded telling his secret love affair partner that he was going to be reincarnated as her tampon. Maybe it's a good time to reconsider those constitutions and national anthems and such.